Yo, everybody. Welcome to Off Panel, a weekly interview podcast about all things comics brought to you by Sketch.com. I'm your host, David Harper, and this week's guest is the writer of Comics Like Friday and the just-released second Reckless graphic novel, Friend of the Devil. It's Ed Brubaker. Thanks for coming on, Ed.
Hey, thanks for having me.
So we're going to get into specifics about Friend of the Devil here in a little bit, as well as Friday, but I want to start by talking just about how that's done so far, because, we did that big feature last year on Sketched about the big changeover to the graphic novels. And since then, the first one came out, seemed like it did really well. The second one came out, and you said in a recent newsletter that it was, and I quote, even better sales velocity than the first one. I think the first one was even at like pulp levels of interest. So, I mean, how's it looking so far?
Yeah, well, pulp was sort of where I felt like the tipping point happened for us, and maybe it was partly related to the pandemic and people being more like, give me things to entertain me, and the comics market had been shut down for 3 months, and we came in pretty much like a month after that. But like My Heroes Have Always Been Junkies was our first graphic novel, and that one we sold through the whole print run, which was like more than we would print of like a first issue of a comic usually.
Wow.
And we sold through that in about 9 months for the hardback, which I was like, oh, that's great. And it was like, I don't want to get into specifics, but it was like over 10,000 more than like the previous issue of like a comic we'd done.
Right.
And I was like, holy shit. And then when we did pulp, I was like, all right, well, it took 9 months to sell Junkies, so we'll, print the same amount of pulp, because I'm like, and hopefully people will care, because it seemed, I remember even my wife looking at it and I like looking at the cover, and I was originally saying, I kind of want the cover to have like the top part to be him as like an old man, and then the bottom part to be him as like the cowboy on the horse. And my wife was like, I don't know, like, don't you want him to look more like, like a book people would want to buy? Which I was like, oh man, it's a story about an old man. So in my head, I was thinking, no one's going to care about this story about an old man. Like even my wife is like, she'll read it. It's practically dedicated to her. but she was pointing out like that it didn't seem like an incredibly commercial project. So I was just thinking, all right, well, our hardcore fans will get it. It'll probably take us a year to sell this print run. And then we were sold out in like a little over a month.
Yeah.
And it was like, I was getting pictures and emails from retailers who were like telling me that they'd sold 200 copies in one day. And, just to be able to get retailers to order 200 copies, by the way, up front, is like the hugest achievement for us for like the comics market, I think, because on a book, retailers usually order how many they think they're going to sell that first weekend, and then they will reorder for moving forward. But, we basically convinced them that they would be losing sales to like online, like Amazon and Barnes and Noble and places, because they know how many people buy our comics at their store. When we put out a new first issue, they know how many they're going to sell. So I was really pushing them like, hey, order this stuff like it's a new first issue of our thing, because like our hardcore fans are probably going to want this. So we did like these signed book plates that come with them. You probably got them.
Oh yeah.
Yeah. So because of those, I think like we ended up on pulp, like the orders went up, from advance orders went up really quick. So when we actually got the numbers, we'd already set the print run, and I was like, oh wow, okay, well, that's higher than I thought it was going to be. But at the same time, I was like, we'll see what it does. But then it just kind of exploded, and and Image was hearing from retailers that were just thrilled with it. And like now, between the paperback and the hardback, it's like our best-selling book ever, I think, so far. I think Reckless was getting close to selling up there. We printed a lot more of Reckless because of that, though, because we sold out of pulp in 6 weeks, and then it took us till January to get the paperback out, because we didn't know, like, did we sell out and that's all people want, or do people want a bunch more? Do we throw away a bunch of money reprinting this hardback because we won't be able to print the same amount as we printed the first time, so our unit cost will go up exponentially? And so it's like there's all this publishing stuff that I have to think about with this.
Yeah.
So the main thing I learned from pulp was Reckless is going to cost like $8 more per unit, like per unit for cover price. But I knew that like we had to print way more. Like there was just like we were going to do a second and third book in the course of the first year, and I didn't want to be sold out of the first book ever. So we printed a fuck ton of those. And you know, which didn't, unfortunately, like the paper we chose to print on in the first book, I think was like a little too crazy. It was even too thick for me, and I like a good paper stock, but like you practically have to break the book open in the middle. But you can't even, like, the paper prices have changed so much even in the months since we printed that one was just like we went all out for that one, because I was like, you know, this is our first one, let's really go all out. It's a 144 page book. I want it to feel really hefty, and but I prefer the paper that we printed the second book on, actually.
Yeah.
But yeah, so the first book for Reckless came out like early December or mid-December of last year, and by the end of the year, within just like 2 weeks, it was already like the number 3 selling graphic novel for the year.
Wow.
Yeah, so the best-selling graphic novels through Diamond last year were Firepower and Pulp and Reckless.
Wow.
Yeah. And then we continued to just sell shit tons, like through January and February. Our reorder, like on the reorders on Reckless were insane, to the point where I was like, oh shit, are we going to still have it in stock when the next book comes out? And so when we set the print run for the next book, we actually advance solicited it. So we had like numbers from people, and the advance orders for Friend of the Devil were like something like 25% higher than the advance orders for Reckless. And now, just a week after it came out, we'd sold almost what Reckless had sold in a month.
Wow.
On like reorders and stuff. Yeah. And book market reorders were really big. Amazon sold out the night, like 5 minutes after it went on sale, which was a fucking nightmare. I was like, oh, cool.
It's like a mix though, right? It's like a nightmare,
yeah,
but it's like a good nightmare.
it is, but yeah, I just always feel like you lose. Like they should have had way more on hand. They should have, they should have looked at how many they'd sold on our last couple books. But unfortunately, I think there's a computer involved in all their decisions, and the computer is like does not. So it's like they always are out. Like they didn't have Invincible in stock for the entire time the Invincible show was on, and Diamond has the books, but Amazon now, there's like this, like Amazon doesn't want to pay for shipping from distributors anymore. So they pick up all their own books. So now getting books to Amazon takes like twice as long as it used to.
It's so wild.
And yeah, and they don't want to have as much stock on hand. So it's like all this stuff is shifting around. So it was just really frustrating. I was like, wow, like, but then I check and like our numbers are still doing really well, even though it's like backlisted for 2 weeks or something.
I think listen to all this. It's really interesting because when we talked last time, actually going back to the first time we talked, when it was for like 10 years of you and Sean working together.
Oh yeah.
You felt like to a certain degree there was like a single issue audience, and then there was like the people who wait for the trades or the hardcovers or whatever. There was like discrete audiences, and then to a certain degree, I imagine for a retailer, like the average retailer, let's say Cape and Cowl Comics, Eitan Manhoff, who was literally ordering piles of books that were the same height as him. So he's not an average retailer, but I mean, the average retailer probably didn't necessarily know with the first Reckless book if it would move to those single issue buyers. It seems like you are kind of keeping those single issue buyers and even growing on top of that, because I don't know. I mean, it's just like, it seems like each release builds and builds.
I mean, that's the hope. But yeah, I feel like Pulp kind of proved to them like that there was a bigger audience, like, because that just kept selling out and the reorders just kept coming for, until we were just out of the print run. I think if we'd had more in stock, we could have sold another 5,000 or 10,000 copies by Christmas probably, but we were just out by like, I don't know, like September or something like that. But I think what happened with the comic size graphic novels was it was the thing that like the people who buy our single issues, but then don't buy the trades or and wait for the deluxe oversized or something like I don't know if we had a bifurcated audience or trifurcated, if that's a word, like the comics people, the trade people, and the oversized hardback people, which Like I felt like there was a lot of crossover between those three groups, but there was always going to be a contingent that just bought the single issue comics and didn't buy anything else because they'd read, like, I don't buy trade collections of every single comic that I collect, because some of them I'm like, all right, I read that.
Yeah.
Like, if it's something that I really love and want to like own. And I feel like one of the things that Sean and I had done for, ever since we put out the first Criminal Deluxe edition was we started making like art objects out of our books, like especially our hardbacks. I feel like it's like a coffee table book that also has great comics in it. Hopefully great. I think they're great. I might be biased. They're great art, at least.
Well, I mean, like talking about what you were talking with your wife about the cover and what you end up with pulp. I mean, I don't know. I was going to bring up this question you had from a listener of this podcast, actually, Ryan Alcock. He asked in your newsletter about marketing graphic novels versus marketing single issues. And I do think that one really big advantage to the graphic novels is that you have these amazing covers for Reckless. You have this amazing cover for Pulp. You have these singular images. And I feel like there's it's weird. It's like having this like movie poster style image that you can point to as like, this is the vibe of this, versus single issues where it's like, I mean, I read all of the most recent volume of Criminal, but if you asked me to recall what issue 5 looked like, I couldn't tell you. But like, I could tell you exactly what Pulp looked like right now. And I think that there is a hard to quantify value to having objects like that, like the art objects you're talking about.
Yeah, no, I agree. I mean, Sean and I go back and forth over covers for hardbacks and stuff. Well, we don't go back and forth that much. Junkies and Bad Night, we went back and forth a ton over the color schemes. And in fact, Junkies, I think Sean did like 10 different sketches before we ended up on the close-up of the girl smoking, which then he used for like the next two covers for the same basic theme of close-ups of people smoking, but the cigarettes moving from side to side. But like, Sean doesn't have to stop every month and draw a new cover. And it's just like, over time, like usually when you're doing a single issue comic, like every cover isn't just the greatest thing ever. Like, you try to make them as good as you can, and you need them in advance for solicitations and stuff. But, ultimately, like I always worry, like, what's the long-term cover that people are going to be seeing on, online or on bookshelves or in the comic store? Like, what's the collection cover? Because that's where you're branding it.
Right.
That's why we put our names like so big on everything too. Like, I have friends who are novelists who are like, you got to make your names even bigger on your covers.
Yeah.
He's like, you guys are the brand. He's like, you're successful as an author when your name is bigger than the title of the book. And I'm like, I don't think we'll ever get to that point where like Ed Brubaker, we'd fill up the top half of the fucking cover. But yeah, I feel like what's kind of happened here is like that shift when we were able to convince enough retailers to actually order heavy on the book for release day was like, it sort of proved to them that like our hardcore audience, which we've been building up for 20 years now almost, like especially since Criminal, but like a lot of our readers go back all the way to like Sleeper, when we were first putting out monthly comics. So like, I feel like a lot of those people just kind of stuck with us. And so when we launched Reckless, especially when we announced it, we said, oh, and the next book is coming out 4 months later. And so it was like, I was trying to sort of be all things to both markets in a way. But I also thought, like, I like that about pulp books, that they come out fairly often, especially back in the 60s and 70s. If you look at the executioner, there's probably like 450 executioner books that have come out. It's like there was probably a point where they were releasing one a month or something like that. I've never, read more than like one or two of them when I was a kid, but like I liked us being proficient enough at like putting out comics regularly that we could release a book in December and another book in April that are both 144 page long, like original graphic novels, and then another one 6 months later, because we had a little bit of lead time because of the shutdown when we started working. But I thought that was like a good sort of balance between like stores then get a couple months to sell the first book, and then whatever they've got left over of the first book, if they still have copies in stock, the second book comes out. And we've been selling a lot more of the first book now around the second book. So it's like I felt like we're still sort of hitting that comic market like regularity thing, because I do agree that like I grew up going to comic stores. If I miss a couple issues of a comic, that might be it.
Yeah.
Like I'm now waiting to read all of like Kaiju Max in like a giant oversized hardback, because I at some point during like season 3 I missed a couple issues and couldn't get them for some reason, and that was it. I'm like, all right, I guess I'm switching to trades, or and so like I feel like what we're doing, the frequency of it really helps to build the readership part, hopefully.
I think one of the underrated parts that people don't really talk about when it comes to single issue comics is it's not really even that people necessarily love the single issue format. It's that there's the repetition to it. There's like
Yeah.
the repeatability. And it's like if you have a cadence that people can kind of set a watch to, whether it's
Yeah.
every 4 months or it's a quarterly or it's monthly or whatever,
Yeah.
people will come back. And as long as they can expect the same quality of work, and I mean, at least 2 in. I mean, I would say 2 in, but you guys have been working together for a long time, so.
Yeah. Well, I mean, but I agree. Like the big, like I mean, I judge everything by the airport bookstore. That if there's a good airport bookstore, you go to like look at its like top 20 or whatever, and it's like they're almost all like big name mystery writers or thriller writers. It's always like a Reacher book and John Sanford, and it's like this list of people, and I've read tons of books by those people, but they're successful enough that basically they're on a schedule. Like they have to release a book every like September or something, or like Michael Connelly puts a book out every November,
right?
And every now and then he puts a second book out during the year that's about a different character.
Yeah. I called Barnes and Noble recently because I was trying to pick up a book that had come out that day, and the person who answered the phone was so stressed out. And when I was like, "What's going on?" She's like, "It's a Grisham day," and I was just like,
Oh.
"It's a Grisham day." I was like, I honestly, I hate to say it, I didn't know Grisham was still writing. Apparently, he is still very prolific, and apparently, he's still very energetic.
That's really funny. Yeah, no, it's I think that that's a thing when you get to a point where people are really following what you do, like whatever level you're at it. Like I would love to be at like a like John Grisham level with what we do.
Yeah.
But I definitely feel like that was one of the things that I leaned into with these books, was like, all right, we're sort of going for that. Like people were jokingly refer to these as dad comics, because they're like comics you can give to your dad who doesn't like comics. I've seen that referred to like more than once now in letters, like or like reviews, and I was just like, oh, this is not exactly what I wanted them to be dubbed as, but I'm fine with that if that's a market that makes people buy 2 copies to give one away for Christmas.
I think that's hilarious because I only saw that term this week for the very first time when somebody I follow on Twitter tweeted that about Fury Max, the Garth Ennis and Goran Parlov book. And they're like, "Oh, I know it's kind of a dad comic." And I was like, "Dad comic? I would not have thought of that as a dad comic, but nor would I have ever thought the term dad comic. But I guess I could kind of see that.
Yeah, anything that you can take out of the continuity of like what people think comics are.
Right.
If you can give someone like my first thing that really established me was Scene of the Crime at Vertigo, which Sean like inked the last 3 issues of like 20 something years ago. It's like 1999 or 1998. And that like I was trying to just sort of do mystery comics, because I was like, I wanted to do the kind of thing I was reading. And I was reading a lot of mystery novels, like detective novels. And I thought, nobody's doing this in comics. Why not?
Right.
And so we did it, and then people didn't, and we got lucky enough to be collected, but nobody really knew what to do with that comic. Like it was originally going to be a monthly, and then it got cut back to a series of miniseries, and then just one miniseries, and then Michael was off drawing Hawkman, and that was it.
Yeah. Yo, everybody. I want to take a quick second to give a shout out to Macroverse. Macroverse is an exciting digital comics platform that makes next-gen comics custom crafted for your phone. Macroverse's comics utilize its unique tap story format, which ensures this isn't a PDF on an iPad or an endless scroll, but a designed for mobile experience where every episode is crafted to take advantage of this one-of-a-kind style. Macroverse is curated for quality, with every series they publish being something they believe deserves to be read by a massive audience. Think of it like HBO for comics, with over 35 titles and 400 episodes from names like Brian Stelfreeze, Juan Doe, Paul Scheer, and more. Check out Macroverse today by downloading the app on iOS or Google Play, and get started with a rotating collection of free episodes, or unlock the entire universe for just $4.99 a month, with half of all profits going to the creators themselves. And now, back to the show. I feel like the market, and this is going to sound like I'm making a dad comic reference, but I feel like the market has matured a lot since then.
Yeah.
In like a really, I mean, both in like the kids market has grown, but also like that adult type of book. I also do think that the dad comic vibe totally fits your idea of like wanting the airport bookstore vibe that you're talking about. Like dad comics are kind of that's kind of that vibe.
That is that is like, it's not just dads, it's like middle-aged, moms and grandmas. I mean, my mom's, or my mom like read all that stuff. My wife's grandmother is like 102 and she still reads mystery novels constantly. Her aunt was always reading mystery novels. I remember giving them some Greg Rucka books that I hadn't read once, and then I started reading through them and I was like, oh my God, there's all this horrifying stuff in this book. It's like really graphic.
Yeah.
It was one of Greg's PI novels, and like some really awful stuff was happening to people in it. And I was like, oh my God, I gave it to my wife's 92-year-old grandmother. And she was like such a fan. Yeah. I was just like, okay. And then I looked at everything else she had, and I'm like, oh, she's got just like piles of these like serial killer books. Like this is nothing for her.
Yeah. So, I mean, look at Knives Out though. That's like a dad movie franchise now, which is like wild.
Yeah, and he's launching a show on Peacock that's like a Murder, She Wrote or something like that too.
Oh, it's super smart.
So, yeah, but I'm totally like trying to hit that market in a way. I remember years ago, so long ago, back in the 80s, I think, or early 90s, Kim Thompson was like writing about what graphic novels needed to become like an actual force in the bookstore market, which I think, which was funny at the time, because what ended up making them a big force in the bookstore market was, of course, manga,
right?
Which none of us saw coming, like really in America. Like none of us were really, like in my generation, we were barely paying attention. We would go to like read Garo or something to get the like weird manga stuff, but we weren't really like I remember when the Barnes and Noble manga sections appeared, and you'd just see like teenagers standing around reading comics. I was like, oh my God, this is a thing. But I remember Kim saying at the time that what comics needed was like basically the equivalent of mainstream fiction in graphic novel form. Like they needed a bunch of John Grisham's or Tom Clancy's, or, like that kind of middle ground, like thriller fiction, just in comics form. And that's what a lot of European comics have been for, 40, 50 years. So like, I feel like Reckless certainly like leaps out of that tradition. I still, I feel like because it's me and Sean and we've been working together for so long, we still try and make it, something that's special and different because it's ours, as opposed to just like following all the standard like tropes of the genre. I feel like we're avoiding some of them and leaning into others and sort of twisting some of them around. But I definitely, my goal was like, it would be great if airport bookstores came back to see like an end cap display of these books someday, and see a bunch of like middle-aged or older men all like, oh, I'm going to read this on the plane to New York. like that would be amazing to me at the same time.
Yeah. I did want to ask about in regards to like the format change, actually just in general, because you've kind of you've escaped like the monthly rhythms, and like between this, which is like you said, like 144 pages, so it's a graphic novel length, and like with Friday on Panel Syndicate, you are doing longer form stories, or really kind of like whatever the hell length of story you want. How does that change things for you? Like, do you still aim for a certain length, or is it more fluid depending on what the story needs?
Well, for the Reckless books, because these are like about twice as long, the Junkies and Pulp were much harder to write than the Reckless books in some ways because the page count was so limited.
Right.
And like Junkies originally was going to be a much longer thing. And then I started working and I realized like, oh no, there's no way. And then I went back and started sort of simplifying down what it needed in it. And then I realized like, oh, the trick of doing like a graphic novella is to figure out how much would fit in a short story and then extrapolate that into like a comic book novella. I think it was actually the twins adapted Neil Gaiman short, How to Talk to Girls at Parties. And that I had read that short story, so I knew how long the story was, and they turned it into like a 72-page book or something like that. And I thought, oh, that helped me click in my brain, because I was always trying to do too much with these books, like the shorter books. And even Pulp, I felt like I always wished I had 10 more pages when I was working on it. Like as I was writing, like each page became harder and harder to write because I was like, oh, I'm getting like, once I got within like 30 or 40 pages at the end, I was worried I didn't leave myself enough room to tell everything, because I knew we'd already chosen the page count and Sean had to draw it and get it, printed by X time. And hardbacks, we found out that like on Junkies take an extra month to print and distribute.
Oh, wow.
Which I didn't realize. So like it totally, like Sean killed himself getting Junkies done. That's why Sean didn't end up like, originally Sean was gonna like color it and have Jake just sort of assist, and then Sean just colored like the first 2 pages and then just told Jake to color it. I was like, here, just follow what I'm doing, what I did there, and have fun with it. But what's changed now, like I do still feel that pressure of like finishing the making sure that the book doesn't go long. So as I get deeper into everything, it gets like more and more aggravating to like finish each chapter, because I'm like, oh, did I leave myself enough room? Like I would love to someday just write one of these graphic novels with absolutely no limitation. With Friday, I don't really think about it as much. Every now and then I'll tell Marcos, like, I think it's going to end up being 28 pages, and then I'll write him back a week later, no, it's going to be like 35. And he always just says, just make it however long it needs to be.
Right.
So like but I don't want it to take forever to come out, and he, works at his own pace. So like the longer I make the scripts, potentially, then it like because he lays out everything and sort of analyzes the script really like intensely and breaks down, like, I think now he's doing it in like halves, but initially he would break down the entire comic into layouts and then do like bigger layouts where he sort of transferred those to pencils. And then like he's like very traditional in his formatting. So everything takes him like 2 or 3 times as long as it takes Sean. And like, so with Friday, I always aim for like 30-ish pages, but I've gone over it like, 2 out of the 3 issues so far. And I think the chapter 4, which Marcos is working on now, I think is like close to 40 pages as well, which is the sort of beginning of Act 2. But yeah, with that, like, I think because Marcos gave me the freedom initially to just sort of let them be as long as they needed to be, now I'm stuck with that in a way. Like every time I've tried to make one like a shorter chapter so that we could get one out quicker, like it's just like the second chapter like initially wasn't even going to exist. Like the whole first chapter was going to end where chapter 3 ended. I thought, like, I was like, oh, this will be like 20 pages and it'll end with this big reveal and people will be like, oh my God. And then as I was writing the first issue, I was like, but then we won't know anything about this character or this town that she's living in. And I started seeing all of Marcos's sketches, and I really wanted to just take time with these characters. And as I started writing, it just kind of found its own pace.
Mm-hmm.
And even in chapter 4, I was trying to like speed things up a bit, and I just couldn't. It's like the story just is sort of requiring its own pace in a way. And thankfully Marcos is fine with that, like, because he wants it to just be good. But but yeah, that it really has sort of, I'm just writing it because I just want to see him draw it right now. Like, like it's really just like, I'm not worrying about anything about it other than that, like that it's something I want to see him draw. And, they're just doing such a fantastic job on it that it's like we're making this thing and putting it out as we make it. And so it's just for the sheer pleasure of the creation of it. And like, how if I had to limit each chapter to 20 pages, like, and hit like a schedule on that, or he had to hit a schedule, I just don't think it would be the same right now. Like, and, we are putting out the first trade paperback collection of it in November. We're going to collect the first 3 chapters as like an act 1, like I think it's going to be smaller than comic size trade. And then when we finish, like the first full Friday book, I think is going to end up being 9 chapters long, and then we'll collect that all, hopefully, in one book after it's done. But who knows how long that will take.
So I think it's funny that you brought up that the end of the first chapter of Friday, or the end of the third one, because
Yeah.
that was one of the things I was going to bring up originally. Is I love that the write-up at the end of the third issue or third chapter, or whatever you want to call it,
Yeah.
about how like it was originally going to be the end of the first 24 pages, and then like 90 or 100 pages later, that's just the way it was. But honestly, it's interesting reading Friday, because if that was the case, if like, if you remove those moments, or moments where you're just like watching Ethan doing what Ethan does, where it's like not essential to the plot or anything like that,
Yeah.
it wouldn't be the same. It's like
No,
you need to see Friday hit a slap shot against this kid's nose to like know a little bit more about who she is and what she stands for and everything.
Yeah, I mean, this is a funny thing. I was talking to one of my good friends as a crime novelist, Sarah Gran, who does an amazing series, the Claire DeWitt series, which are I can't even describe them. They're like existential private eye stories, but they're like experimental and weird and fun, and you just love her character. And there's like books within the books that like the character reads that sort of inspired her. But I was talking to her when I was starting to work on the third book, because I realized the third book was going to be so different than the first 2 in some ways, and have much less to do with sort of the plot of the mystery, and be much more about the characters. And I was like, after I'd done 2 of these books, I was calling her up and I'm like, so the plot isn't actually that important, right? And she's like, no, not at all.
Yeah.
Like, no good mystery book are you remembering like the twists and turns of the plot. You're thinking about the characters and their world and the things that you love about these people, and like why you're rooting for them. And so it's just kind of funny, because like with Friday, I know the general plot for the entire arc, and there is one there. But yeah, like for me, so much of the joy of that book, like I said, I thought the second issue or second chapter or whatever would end up being like 12 pages long of just like backstory to get you where, and then it ended up being 40 pages long, because I was like, oh yeah, but the lady in the woods and like all this stuff. So it's like a ton of stuff happened, but really all that happened in Friday chapter 2, like plot progression wise, is she went to bed and thought about stuff, got out of bed and started walking across town. And then chapter 3 is her walk across town in the middle of a snowstorm. But you learn so much about the town and her history and like what's going through her head. Like I just really just kind of love being in that town with her, like, and being in that. One of the things that both I'm we can talk about this as we go along, but like Friday sort of inspired Reckless in some ways, because like they're both period pieces, though Friday is obviously a fantastical made up world, whereas Reckless takes place in the specific 80s of specific Los Angeles and California, and doesn't have any made up cities in it. But like what we're doing with Friday so much is like trying to recreate a time period that that only exists from like the mid 60s to the mid 70s in young adult fiction. Like we're creating like the feel of an era in a way. And I love just sort of going back to that sort of fake 70s with Marcos, and just sort of being like, all right, so what happened to these people when they grew up?
Yeah.
And and how can we continue to do these things?
I'm just honestly like, it's hard for Marcos to continuously amaze me, but he just constantly does. There's this one, it's like this little thing that shouldn't be that big of a deal, but there's like 3 panels on page 15 of Friday number 3 where she's walking to the White House. Friday's walking to the White House, and she's talking about how she's trudging out to see Lance in the middle of the night. And she said, and feeling like herself for the first time since the summer. In the first one, she's like looking down and it's all like in shadow.
Yeah.
And then the second one, she's smiling. And then the third one, no words, all of a sudden kind of a frown. And it's just like little things
Yeah.
like that really underline just how special of an artist Marcos is. And also the value of taking that time, because that 3 panel sequence says so much about Friday and her state of mind in that moment. I love it.
Yeah, it really, I mean, it's funny because we actually expanded that, not that scene, but the scene after it when she's like sledding down the hill. Like we ended up adding like an extra couple pages to that so that there would be more like movement on the sledding, because like originally the sledding was just a 2-page sequence and like all these panels at the bottom, and I was like, no, let's really show it and have like a splash page for the light going up from the tree and all that. Like and because he'd just been doing such a good job and taking so much time with everything else, and it just suddenly felt like we were rushing in to this ending that was going to be chaotic and crazy, and I wanted to like move into it slower and also spend more time looking at how great his art looks, because I mean there's so much detail in there. I just feel like and all the sketches he does for the books, inside the books and stuff, like the black and white sketches of Friday and Lance as kids that were in chapter 2. Like I just want to like spend a lot of time with all those details, and I can't believe how lucky I am that he wants to draw this thing. Like I had this vague idea for a book, and he reached out to me to ask about like working on something, and I just immediately thought it would be great to see his style crossed with like a little bit of Edward Gorey or something.
Mm-hmm.
And I don't think that that's really what he's done, but I think it's like I can't stop looking at the art when I get it. It's just so much fun to see what he's doing and creating this little fictional town. And like I actually worry about like where things are in relation to each other. And like I was really into the idea that they hang out at a donut shop because they're kids. The idea of like being paid in donuts would be really funny.
I love the scene with Father Poole, and like the fact that apparently he's not actually like a father. He's he's not like little things like that. Those are like the little details, and also like the fact he's looking for a French fry and like something's going on. I mean, and the fact
all
that
that stuff comes back later, I think.
Well, I mean, I really like that. That's one of the things that I really love about Reckless too, or excuse me, about Friend of the Devil. So you have your constants in Friend of the Devil. You have Ethan, you have Anna, you have holy crap, FBI guy whose name is completely escaping me. Frank Hancock.
Yeah, Frank Hancock,
yeah. But at the same time, you have like little characters that get introduced in like, or a character who gets introduced in Friend of the Devil, who I now want to be a regular. Byron, the film.
He's in the next book.
Is he?
Yeah, he brings the case to Ethan in the next book, actually.
Oh my God.
The film nerd.
Yeah. I mean, just having him in there, it's funny because it's like there's always those people who are kind of like the experts in the field. Like, it's like any cop show. It's like, they go down and they visit like the person who works in the morgue, like the coroner or whatever. And it's like they have all these different little characters that kind of help along the way. And I love that he's based in the El Ricardo, and like when he needs help, he turns to this film nerd who he gets his movies from,
who like literally like fixes projectors, can get you old films, has like tons of old trades and like film and like journals. Like I don't know if there's actually a magazine that would tell you what movies were playing at drive-ins, but I love the idea that there's like a drive-in quarterly or something where it's like, oh yeah, this was what's available this quarter, like a distributor's catalog for like drive-in movie theaters. Because in the early 70s, of course, there would have been like hundreds of drive-in theaters, if not thousands of them. But yeah, that was like a really conscious thing, because I just was thinking, like I need it's like you have to go to the library, you have to talk to experts. There's all this stuff that you used to have to do when you were researching things. Like, when I used to try to find like out of print books or something, I felt like it was almost like being a private eye. Like you just end up calling different experts and trying to get tips on like stores that might have it, and then calling different stores around and getting tips from them on, things, where it felt like you struck gold if you found like a book for $35 that had been like 50 cents originally.
Yeah. Well, and it's such a, I don't know, it's obviously it's very, I feel like it's very relatable to comic fans. Like Byron is like comic fan adjacent, where
Oh yeah.
where Ethan comes to me, he's like, Sirens of Satan, and he's like, oh, there was only like 3 prints of that made. I'm like, of course you know that. You're that type of nerd. That's how it works.
Yeah, exactly. The comic book guy. Yeah. Yeah, I always love when there's like a person like that at any like any kind of field. Like I imagine Tarantino was that guy at the video store he worked at, where like if you came in and you wanted something, you told him what else you liked, and he would give you 45 perfect options.
Mhm.
Well, if you like that, here's everything I like and that was made in Hong Kong. But like I love those people with encyclopedic knowledge, and those people are so a throwback to a different time in a way. If you're not in comics, if you're not part of like a kind of geek culture of some kind, like comic or film nerds or something, because like now everybody just looks at their phone and gets all that information instantly.
I was going to bring up the same thing. It's like that's almost not special now because you can just pull up your phone and do it. But like back in like 1985, if you could Sirens of Satan, I mean, Byron was a wizard.
Yeah. Oh yeah, he totally is. Yeah. No, I love that character. Yeah, I was like consciously like I need to create like this guy and have him be like a really fun, memorable character who even knows people in the industry. But like the people he knows in the industry are on that weird kind of lower level, like, oh, she worked at Canon Films.
Yeah.
Like a throw. Like I was like, oh, she went up from the sort of Roger Corman-y, like wherever, whatever that studio was that made the drive-in pictures that she worked on, and then went up to the 80s equivalent of that company.
I was going to say, I don't know when Trauma started, but I feel like he would have gotten involved with Trauma in some way. But
yeah. Yeah, Trauma was, I first heard of Trauma in the 80s. I bet they started in the 60s probably.
Did they?
Wow. I don't know. I wouldn't, I'd have to look it up, but I know James Gunn wrote Romeo and Juliet like at some point in like the 80s or early 90s. I remember watching that on video a lot. I think the first time I heard of a Trauma movie was probably Surf Nazis Must Die, or there was that creepy one they had where there was like a recurring monster character who was like a good guy. Toxic Avenger.
I was gonna say, yeah, didn't they do Toxic Avenger?
That was like 80s, I think. So yeah.
I watched those movies when I was a kid, and I remember my mom just being like, "What are you watching?" And I'm like, "I don't know. I guess I'm watching this."
Yeah, midnight movies.
Yo, everybody, I want to take a quick second to talk about the crew over at Bad Idea. Do you like bone-shredding destruction, wanton corporate malfeasance, and reckless use of industrial machinery? Then buckle up, because Bad Idea, the unruly and experimental new comic book publisher, is back with Tankers, on sale in select comic shops now from New York Times best-selling writer Robert Venditti and blockbuster artist Juan Jose Ryp. A global energy conglomerate has just solved our impending oil shortage, and their plan is pretty simple. Send a team of contractors armed to the teeth in mech suits back to the Cretaceous period, tweak the trajectory of the meteor that killed the dinosaurs, and give mankind another 500 millennia worth of oil reserves. What could go wrong? Only all of human history, of course. Tankers from Bad Idea, on sale in select comic shops now. And now, back to the show. To get a little bit more into Friend of the Devil, for listeners that don't know, that's the second Reckless graphic novel you did with Sean and Jacob Phillips. I don't know. It's funny watching people bend over backwards trying to like describe Ethan. I'm going to call him a badass with a moral compass and few ethical complications.
Yeah.
In this one, he's helping his significant other, Lynn Tran, find her missing sister, which leads to problems in the form of like the late 70s, the remnants of the late 70s movie scene and your seemingly run-of-the-mill sex cult. I loved it. I actually, this is weird to say, like I feel like I liked it even more than the first book, despite the fact that it, has a lot of hallmarks. And one of the things that I think is interesting about this book is that the first book got a lot of the introductory heavy lifting out of the way in some ways.
Yeah.
Do you feel like that not having to have those introduction requirements or the need to like fully identify Ethan's past, like you can just bring Frank in and all of a sudden you know that he used to be in the FBI and stuff like that. You can shorthand this stuff to a certain degree. Did that
Yeah.
change things for you and Sean?
Well, for me, for sure, I thought, well, it's funny because uh I thought it would make it easier to get into the mystery quicker every time than it actually has turned out to be. I find that my tendency with these books so far is to spend a lot of time on like what the character's been up to and what they're going through before we get to the big case that they're going to be working through the book.
Mm-hmm.
And I thought after the first one, because the first one really like introduces his whole backstory, it's sort of a twist on the, getting revenge for somebody, and then the end is sort of twist that around to where it's just like, oh fuck.
Yeah.
I don't want to spoil it for people who haven't read it yet, but it, it was really like, it seemed to be driving in one direction and then it was really going in another direction, and there was like some twists on top of twists, and I was really happy with that. But mostly I was thinking, okay, now I don't have to do, like people, I will assume that people have read book one when they are picking up the next book, but I want to make sure that it's completely readable to someone who hasn't too. So I try to do a little bit of it, but not as much, as like the first 3 pages of every Marvel book for, from the 70s until recently, where they always have to recap who the character is and why you should care about them. And so it's like, I felt like with Friend of the Devil, it's like, it kind of jumps around in time a bit. Like we start out further in, and then we flash back to how he met Lynn and the case he was working on there. And then it sort of flashes back from there to like the reason that he ended up taking that case was because he was like sort of caught in a funk after his dad passed away, and sort of dwelling in his nostalgia, which is like, obviously he lives and works out of a movie theater, and he has his own private movie collection, and he doesn't let other people into the theater. Like he's even though he claims to not feel anything, he's surrounding himself with nostalgia from his own youth all the time, and sort of creating his own world in that theater. So I really felt like I ended up spending a lot of time still before you got to the big twist with Lynn seeing her sister in the movie that he bought when he was, basically he's off on his like personal like thing, like buying all these films that remind him of his childhood, and in amongst them, and I know this because like we used to collect like 16 millimeter films and 8 millimeter films and stuff because we have projectors, and my wife was really into getting like 16 millimeter stuff for this Bell and House Sando film that she has. And every now and then you'd find like one thing that you want in a lot of like 10.
Yeah.
So you'd end up getting like a bunch of stuff, and you're like, oh, well, here's a bunch of commercials from the 60s. That's kind of cool. And you'd end up getting all these reels of different sizes to get like an old Lee Marvin show from 1958 or something.
Mm-hmm.
And so I just like the idea of like, well, what if something weird was on one of those? Like those other films in the box that you weren't even trying to buy. You wanted an episode of Beanie and Cecil, and you ended up getting like a weird drive-in movie from 1978 too. And but yeah, I assumed that I would get to that a little bit sooner than I did actually, and I was like, oh well, but I was just having so much fun spending time with the characters. Like I really do feel like that's the key of these books, is like this weird balance between spending enough time with the characters so we all feel like we know them. Like Anna hasn't really been in the books that much, but I still feel like the scenes where she's been in it, you really know who she is. And she's much more in the third book. A lot of the third book is actually about their relationship as it goes on, because they're getting older. And I always thought like one of the cool things about doing the books is like the jumping years between books, because then you get to sort of establish a new status quo every time a little bit, or show that nothing's changed in some ways, but time has changed around them. But yeah, I do feel like, like now I will assume anyone who picks up these books, you know, probably comic people especially, will start with the first one.
Yeah.
You know, like they don't have to. They can read it, like with Criminal, you can read them in any order. There's plenty of people who have read the more recent Criminal stuff and have never gone back and read like the first like 6 books that we did way back when. And then when they read them, they're like, oh, that was tied into this. I didn't even realize that. That's cool. So I always try to maintain that balance a little bit. But yeah, that is like one of the tropes of the genre, of doing like a troublemaker slash PI kind of character. Like when you pick up a Travis McGee book and you start reading it, like the first couple pages always kind of remind you of who he is and what his life is like. But then beyond that, it's just like it kind of gets, I mean, often they just start with like, oh, so and so came in this day. And then through the course of the next chapter or so, we learn, you know, oh, I live on this boat and my best friend is this guy who lives on a boat down the way who helps me on cases sometimes. And, you know, like that's really all you need to know in some ways, because mystery books are really a sort of about what the character's going through, and the case a little bit like has to be something that's important, that sort of makes them question something, hopefully.
I like the way that you structure it, because it's like with both books, there's like the cold open seems wrong, but it's like the flash
Yeah, it's
forward.
a flash forward kind
Yeah.
of, yeah.
Yeah. Well, it's
Definitely flashes to
because,
later in the book.
yeah.
Quite late in both of them.
But I mean, that's one of the fast. I was trying to think about this because it's a flash forward in this story, but the entire thing is being narrated from the present-ish.
That's like a teaser almost.
Yeah.
Like we're gonna get to this part where there's action.
Yeah.
There's gonna be 80 pages of talking now.
But one thing I really love about what you do with it though is like you know, the first thing, like the main story only comes to be because he has this case where he's trying to find God, what's his name, Richard Fuller. And
yeah,
and the thing that's nice about it is like you say so much about Ethan as a person and like about his capabilities just by showing him trying to find Richard Fuller. I mean, it really comes down to him. I love, like, there's some little things that you do that are like shorthand for his like capabilities, and like the way that he's like, you know, the little things that he does to like find solutions, like going through the obituaries and like the microfiche to try to find like names that Richard Fuller could have taken, or like there's 2 parts that I really love in the first 2 books. The first one, there's him popping out like the tail light, so he knows that he can track the people better. And then the other one is like the whole bit about the clipboard. It's just like the clipboard is nice, like shorthand for like this guy has been doing this for a while, and like this is like tricks of the trade.
Yeah,
I don't know. That stuff's really nice.
Both of those come from actual private eyes too. Yeah, the guy used to use an ice pick. Actually, he would poke a hole with an ice pick through the tail light of a car he was going to follow, and that way he could follow it from further away, because there'd be this bright, it would be red with this bright thing of white popping out of the red, where it was like, oh, so that one with the fucked up tail light, that's the one I'm following. But yeah, and the clipboard one like came from like this private eye that worked for my brother-in-law, who was like a criminal defense attorney in San Francisco. He was like a really famous private eye who like let me interview him a couple times.
That's awesome.
But yeah, he was, you know, his biggest thing was like, as a private eye, first off, you don't carry a gun, like, which I'm like not following those rules with Ethan. Ethan's not officially a private eye. Like, he's just sort of whatever.
Problem solver.
He's a problem solver. He's a fixer, I guess, or a troublemaker. And the third book is much more relying. I wanted, after the first 2 books, I wanted to make sure that the third book was a completely different kind of job for him to do, and like just structurally, it feels like a little bit different. Like the movements of it are different. Like they're more, each sort of act is almost a contained thing in a way that sort of builds on the ones that came before, as opposed to just sort of flowing right through them. And it was just because I didn't want to feel like I was just doing the same thing over and over again, but also I wanted to be like, well, what other kind of cases would he take? There's a reason it's called Destroy All Monsters.
I do want to bring up Destroy All Monsters though, because I rereading both of the books, it is funny. There are very specific panels in both that like showcase the Destroy All Monsters poster at the El
Yeah.
Ricardo. And I do, in my brain, of course, is just like, is the book called Destroy All Monsters because the poster keeps showing up, or is the poster keep showing up because you thought Destroy All Monsters might come into play later? And I just
Oh yeah, no, I always knew that the third book was going to be called Destroy All Monsters. Like when I first came up with my notebook for the Reckless books so far, I've filled up basically one notebook so far with the first three, but there's like a whole section that was just about the publishing plan when I was first sketching out the idea, like how to do this, like how to do graphic novels instead of single issues. And so I wanted to make sure I had ideas for at least three of them. So I jotted down like the initial like 2 sentence version of the idea and then threw names on them. And then when I was writing down what the third one was going to be, I was like, oh, I should call that Destroy All Monsters. And then I was like, oh, and I'll put the poster on the wall of the theater, like because it's sort of like a mission statement for Ethan in a way, is like, one of the reasons he does what he does is because he just hates all the people who are making the world a worse place, even though he feels like the world is kind of doomed.
right.
Underneath of it all, he still is like, just because we're all doomed doesn't mean you can't try and make the world a little bit better for people instead of worse.
Yeah. I mean, not to advocate for the blatant murder of individuals and stuff like that, but in the first book, he completely fucks up. I mean,
Oh yeah,
like he totally screws up. At the same time, the it kind of fits his mission. It definitely the Destroy All Monsters.
it's bad people.
Yeah.
he's luckily he's brain damaged enough to be able to to live with himself over it. Like I don't feel he's haunted by the things that he does. Like especially I get to that a little bit in the second book, that he's he just feels like it's about staying on this path and being able to do what's necessary.
It is interesting when you think about it though, because I mean, I say to the person who's writing the comic, but I mean, it's just like, it's interesting that the only time he does sleep well, literally, is after he finishes a case. It's like he has, as soon as he goes through the act of like, I don't know, fixing the world in his own special Ethan Reckless way, it's like that's when he has peace.
Yeah, it's like a catharsis or something. Like he's got pressure building up, and then he goes and he sort of unleashes on a problem or some people, and then he's able to actually like get like this release in his head where he can sleep for a week or two or more.
Yeah.
And sort of get back into the sort of his carefree life as a surfer.
I do think it's, you mentioned about how these books are kind of building on each other. And I think it's kind of fascinating to look at Reckless as something that's building on everything. Like, you wrote in the back of Friend of the Devil about how like a lot of this is basically touring your own life, like except for Ethan's 15 years older than you. And so you're able to kind of go through like the satanic panic stuff and all the things like that. But it is interesting looking at it too through like the prism of what you and Sean have done together, because it's like this book kind of has some like Fatale vibes of this, the satanic panic stuff. There's the Fade Out stuff with Hollywood, like the Hollywood collection and the connection to the movies and everything like that.
Definitely,
Do you feel like, I mean, this is going to make it sound like you're working on your magnum opus or something like that, but I mean, in some ways it feels like a culmination. Reckless feels like a culmination of what you and Sean have been doing together for a long time.
I think it is like by accident in a way. Like I think it's different. I mean, if you look at the book, if you looked at the artwork in the graphic novels and compared them to the artwork that Sean was doing in our single issue comics and stuff, and just the way that we were telling the stories, I feel like the graphic novels are a little bit more open in the storytelling. We take a little bit more time with our scenes. There's less panels, but more stuff happening, and like we're really embracing the sort of freedom of the graphic novel part of it. But I do feel like we just kind of lucked into this thing. Like we were going to do something else, and that would have been much more, like, I don't know, it would have been like our version of like a sort of fantasy or magic kind of thing, which, maybe someday we'll do. But but it also, I think, was going to be kind of depressing and bleak in a way. And with the pandemic, I just really felt like I wanted us to try to do something that was fun. And I was having so much fun on Friday too. And I just thought, like, what have Sean and I never really done? We've never really just done a good guy. Like, what's our version of a good guy? And I know one of the things that Sean and I are both passionate about is old pulp book covers.
Mm-hmm.
Like, and like, I will read the books actually. Sean just likes the Robert McGinnis art, or like there's Mitchell Hooks and all these amazing artists. So a lot of times when we're talking about cover art, we're sending each other old, like, painted covers from the like 50s through the 70s. And I was just looking at all that stuff and I just thought, like, what if we just did that? And I had no idea pulp was going to be like a huge hit at that point. I just thought, what if, well, like, comics might be gone, like single issue comics might be gone because the market shut down. But we can do this graphic novel, and assuming Image is still in business, they can put it out. And then I just started thinking, like, what would be fun to do with Sean that really appeal to both of us, and what we're both good at. And he'd been doing those cover paintings for the new editions of the Criminal hardbacks, and they're all these amazing montages. And I just thought, oh, I want him to do something that he can do that kind of cover style for. It all kind of fell into place really quickly one day when I was just like, what if we did like a series of pulp novels starring like a recurring character who was, instead of it being like a crook, like we've done Criminal for 15 17 years now, like, but like, so if I wanted to do something that was kind of like the Parker books, but what would be different about it? It was like, oh, what if he's a good guy who still has that same kind of mindset where he will do what the fuck he needs to get his job done, and outside of someone like the Punisher in comic books, and only when Garth Ennis or other people, only the Punisher Max books have ever treated the Punisher seriously as a character in a way. He's always just kind of this superhero guy using rubber bullets and stuff, which is just ridiculous. But the Punisher was just a spinoff of like Mac Bolan and the Executioner. So like, I just felt like it had enough of that sort of pulp vibe, but also would really feel like a comic book in a way.
Mm-hmm.
And Darwin's books were such proof of, concept of that you could take a really great pulp novel and turn it into a pulp graphic novel by letting the pictures do so much of the work for you. Like, one of the things I've really loved about writing these books is, if I were to have tried to write either of these things as a novel, they'd be 2 or 3 times as long. But the art does so much of the work for us, and we can do these sort of montage scenes where I can have text down one side that's sort of talking you through like a week of stuff, and you see these images. So it's like we're seeing these locations, and we're seeing, them in different, like we're seeing moments pass. So it's just like the art does so much of the work for telling the story and moving it forward. And it was only really looking at how Darwin had adapted those books that made me think, oh, like, we could do this and break away from that. Like, every chapter must be X amount of pages long. For us, it was like 24 to 28 pages every month, basically.
Yeah.
And like, it really started to feel like it was like I was just getting tired of having to have each chapter be that length and be, like, I loved what we did with it with Cruel Summer, but after doing that, I was like, I don't want to do that again. Like, I don't want every chapter to have to feel like a completely self-contained story that then builds on, another thing that sort of, ends up feeling like this epic. I wanted to do something that was like a short, sharp, like punch to the face kind of fun book with a cool character who you would like root for and want to come back and see what he got up to next. Like, I love books like that. And like, I decided if we just embraced that part, it would feel like it made sense for everything we'd done before. Like it does feel like we were moving towards doing something like this. And, on the commercial side, it was just kind of like, maybe this will be the way we can unite all of our diverse readerships into one. And there's probably some people, I haven't heard any complaints from our single issue readers so far that they're pissed that we're not releasing it as single issues. So, all positive signs from all of our. I haven't, we got so much more response to these books than we've gotten from anything we've done, and I don't even have. You have to like look up how to contact me to figure out, because there's nothing in the book that tells you how to. But the response has been just overwhelmingly amazing, and everybody loves the quality of the printing of the books and the covers, and people are really into the object itself. And that I just kind of feel like we got really lucky, and that all of our interests in how we want to present our work kind of culminated at this point where, I don't know if the market is shifting. Like, if you look at comic book sales, I would say the market is still pretty healthy for single issue comics, as long as they have 37 different covers.
Right.
And I don't know how healthy that says a market is, but I feel like when I know that there's like hundreds of stores that are selling like somewhere between 50 and 200 copies of my hardback graphic novel, I'm like, that feels like a healthy market.
Yeah.
Because that feels like books that are being sold to readers, actually, and we got asked a couple different times by like big retailers if we would do like variant cover versions of the books. And I was like, no. like one thing, like it took so long for Sean to draw this really great cover. Like, this is the cover of the book. This is the book. If you're buying this book, it's because you want to have one of our books and you like what we do. And
I just don't think that's really your audience either. I mean, like,
yeah,
even the single issue reader
collectors.
Yeah. I mean, like, I was a single issue reader, but I mean, honestly, like, I'm thrilled about being able to switch over to Reckless as is, because to my right is literally 37 long boxes. And I love your comics, Ed, but fuck that. I am not going to dig through that and find all those single issues, but I can just grab this. I reread that because it's so easy to get. I mean, but rereading all of those criminal issues, or all the issues of Incognito, or all the issues of Fatale, I have all of those in one of those boxes over there, but that is a pain in the ass. This is so easy. I want to bring up one thing, though, involving, not to make this a single issues versus graphic novel thing, but one of the things that's interesting is I have a weird standout sequence in Friend of the Devil. I love the 3 pages where Ethan's head is covered, so he can't see. And so I have to imagine Sean also loved that sequence, because it meant he had to draw anything.
Yeah, that was a bit of a cheat on my part, because I really I needed all that information to get across there, and I also wanted to establish that he's being held captive with a bag over his head for quite a long time. Like, a normal person would not be okay with that. I love that one blank panel. It's like there's no text at all, and it's like, oh, okay.
I mean, but that whole thing says so much about him as a character, and it's really great. And also, it's fun reading that, where you're visualizing in a way that like Sean wouldn't necessarily in your head, and it works out. I mean, I love it. I think it's fantastic. But one of the things that struck me when I was listening to you talk about all this stuff is, think about if you were doing this in single issues, and if 3 pages of a 20 issue comic were blank effectively, readers would have lost their minds maybe. But as a 144 page graphic novel, that's a drop in the hat, and it's all of a sudden it's a rhythm change, and it works better.
It's like 3.5 pages of a book. And it really, I remember when I came up with that, when I was writing it, I initially was gonna have you see him and all that stuff, and I just thought, oh, how much better to have it be in his perspective, and then have us have it removed, so then we're in his POV when it's being removed, and we're in the dark with him, and we're learning all about his FBI training, and I mean, there's so many. I'm cheating so much there with the like lying to the audience because of what happens in that scene, but yeah, I really that was a moment too where I just thought, well, it's probably more pages. Like, the book is ending up being longer than I thought it was going to be. I remember telling Sean, and I was like, but you'll be excited because 3.5 of these pages are totally black. Just black panels. It took him like 5 minutes to do the lettering.
Oh my God. I love it. It's as soon as I write So when I know somebody's coming on the podcast, I always do like a read of a book where I just take notes to myself. And I do the notes by like I sent myself an email. The subject was just Brubaker. And by the end of it, it was like 27 emails long. And one of them was literally just basically like, I bet Sean loved those blank pages.
Yeah.
Because I knew he had to have. But just a few more questions. You mentioned this earlier about how Anna is like going to be a big focus for the third book. But I really do love having these kind of, because one of the central hallmarks of Ethan as a character is he's kind of, as he described it in the first book, flat. He doesn't really change as much. He's like kind of constant, but like you have like little subtle things that you don't bring a lot of attention to it, but like Anna in the first book is like desperate to have her midnight movie things with the decline of Western civilization, the punk movie, and like them to destroy the place and pee all over the carpet and yada, yada, yada. And then in the second movie, you just have her having a radio show in the El Ricardo where she's playing like Sly and the Family Stone. And there's
she's out at Santa Monica Community College.
Yeah. But either way,
which I tried to get actual reference for the old DJ booth there, but I couldn't get anybody to respond. But all that Santa Monica library stuff is totally accurate.
That's awesome. I just love though that like something simple like that, you can underline that, it's not that Anna's not.
And her fashion changes a little,
and her hair too.
Too. Like she went from being like punk to sort of a post-mod look in the second book.
Mm-hmm. Well, and you can, you see the evolution of these characters and the people around him and how they're kind of changing. And like, that's nice, especially considering the fact, like I said, you have Ethan is like this totem that stays the same.
Yeah, exactly. Because I feel like that's an important part to a detective story in some ways too, is like one of my favorite like writers of all time, but definitely my favorite like detective series ever was the Ross McDonald Lou Archer series. And you learn so little about Lou Archer over the course of, I think, 25 books or something like that. And the mysteries are amazing. And I love him as a character, but I feel like I only know like 5 things about him. Like he's an ex-juvenile delinquent, he has an ex-wife, and he was briefly a cop in Long Beach.
Mm-hmm.
I think, or a cop in Long Beach like saved him or something, but he was briefly a cop at some point in the 40s. But yeah, you learn very little about him. He's just sort of your eyes into this other thing. And with Ethan, like part of it, I think, was wanting to create a character who came from that sort of 60s, 70s period and was a clash between all of it. And, but, I think a lot of people maybe feel like they're a little bit flatter or as they get older and, like you just kind of, you don't respond to things as emotionally as you used to. So it was the combination of that and being able to sort of write about my own childhood. I feel like this is the most, even though Ethan is nothing like me in a lot of ways, I feel like it's still the most I've been able to sort of write about what it feels like to be a Navy brat.
Yeah.
Way, like that sort of, and I've talked about this with other like Navy brats that I've met before who are also like writers or musicians or whatever. And we all sort of grew up feeling like we were like these outsiders who we wished that like we had that group of friends that we grew up with. I remember every time I would watch Diner and I would get to the end when they were all sitting around the table, like this group of 5 friends who'd known each other since they were 5 years old or whatever, just feeling like really jealous that I didn't have that experience, because it was like all my friends were people. My best friend was someone I knew for like 8 months, maybe, and like I just didn't have that kind of long-term life bond with a lot of people in my childhood. That because I still feel like 80 or more percent of people probably grow up in the same town they're raised in. Like unless you have parents who like to move around a lot, most people are raised at least in the same city, if not in the same house that they are in when they're like 3. They're there until they graduate from high school or go to college or whatever.
Yeah, I will say that I have a text thread with 4 of my best friends, most of whom I met met in like 8th grade. But conversely, I will say that my professional relationships are far less satisfying and long lasting than yours, because you and Sean have been working together for forever. So trade-offs, plus and minuses.
Yeah, that's true. Yeah, I started working with Sean the same time I started dating my wife. They're
Wow,
the two longest relationships in my life.
that's amazing.
So yeah, it's pretty amazing.
One of the notes that I actually sent to myself was basically it was just like Sean and Ed are having a lot of fun with this. And there was a very specific moment in Friend of the Devil, which is weird that this is the moment, but you're going to recall, readers who have actually read this comic are going to recall towards the end, there's a moment where there's an arrow that points to a specific item that is hidden that says it's under here. And I wrote a note to myself and I was like, these guys are having fun right now.
Yeah, that was really funny too, because when I wrote that sequence, I was trying to figure out, how do I get away with like showing where he hit it, because
Perfect.
And then I just was like, oh, comic books, arrow with words in it that's like explains it. It's like, that's all you need to know. Like, because originally there was like a whole thing that said where he hit it, like with his narration, and I'm like, God, I'm taking up all these words on a one panel sequence.
Oh my God. When I came across that, I was like, oh my God, this is so perfect. I love this
Yeah,
so
we use
much.
thought balloons every now and then too, and people are always like pointing out, like, "Oh my God, you use the thought balloon." I'm like, "Yeah, I mean, do you never think?
Yeah.
Like, why would I not use thought balloons? Chris Ware and Dan Clowes use thought balloons. Like, I think there's thought balloons in Mouse."
It's just a different tool in your comic creator tool belt. You use what you got. I mean, I thought that the arrow was both like a very fun and kind of elegant solution for pointing out it's under here.
Yeah, because I did want people to know, like, okay, well, how is, because it's like, well, if he didn't get rid of that film, then probably it would have disappeared. Like, cops would have got it and would have made it disappear, because it's like, oh, some of those local cops would have probably been on the take,
Yeah.
or like, who knows? I mean, someone in the cops like let this cult leader guy know that like the FBI was sniffing around him. So it's like, you know, like, who do you trust when you're Ethan, when you've been on like both sides of the law? He doesn't really trust anybody except his old handler now,
I mean,
you know.
especially after the events of that book, because I mean,
Yeah.
that's a shit show mess. I gotta say, like, I never put the Punisher connection together. Not saying that he's like totally like the Punisher, but
Oh yeah, no.
the ending of the book, he is certainly at his most punishing. Let's say that. But anyways, well, I want to close with something super random that has nothing to do with Reckless or anything. I'm really fascinated by the idea of you sitting around with friends watching BMX Bandits, like we talked about last time. In my grand scheme of Ed Brubaker headcanon, I never once was like, this is a guy who watches bad movies with friends. That was what you were doing during the pandemic. I have to ask, we talked about that a fair amount last time. I'm curious as to, since then, I mean, not whether or not
Oh
you're
yeah.
still doing them, but what's been your favorite so far? What's been the standout bad movie?
Well, I hate to call it bad. I mean, it is, but the probably the most popular one among the whole group, which is a very like, I think it's more women than men. It's about like 12 or 15 people at this point. The standout that everybody loved the most, I think, was actually Beastmaster.
All right.
A shockingly enjoyably like weird movie from the 80s that I also used to watch every day as a kid because it was always on HBO.
Yeah.
For a while, we actually called HBO, "Hey, Beastmaster's on." And it was like Beastmaster or Moscow on the Hudson. Those were always on in the 80s when I was like growing up. And yeah, that was like a favorite. We went into like a big De Palma phase, like watching like we watched Blow Up, which is actually a great movie, but also has some really over the top stuff that you can make fun of. It's a really, I mean, since the pandemic is still going on and we're all like, a lot of people now have gotten vaccinated and stuff. I don't know if it's going to wind down or not, but it really has become like a life-saving thing. And every now and then someone will suggest like a serious movie, and I'm like, what are you doing? Like, how are we going to make fun of this movie? Like,
Do
even
you not remember Beastmaster?
yeah, one of my favorite movies that we've watched actually is a really great movie, but it's also like very of its age, so you can also kind of point out like all the crazy shit in it, which was that old Burt Lancaster movie, The Swimmer, where he's like basically swimming. It's based on a John Cheever story about a guy who's swimming across his neighbor. He realizes that he lives in somewhere in, like, I want to say upstate New York or somewhere where it's like really like wooded, remote, like people who worked in the advertising industry lived there, and you could get like acres of land. So like he realized he could swim from pool to pool across all of his neighbors' yards in one day, and swim across their whole area all the way back to his own house. And so he's just kind of wandering from pool to pool, and like he ends up like picking up a woman at like one of the pool parties who kind of starts wandering with him, like they're going to be these wandering pool nomads. It's like an insane movie, but I mean, you should see it just because it's so crazy. But yeah, that was a big favorite because it was like so of its era. It has uh oh shit, what's her name, the she's a stand-up. It was like her first film role ever. Anyway, I'm gonna forget it. But yeah, it was a really fun one. But yeah, now we're to the point where we actually have, everyone has submitted like tons of terrible movies, and they have to go through a rigorous like approval process where everyone's like, oh, that might be too good. Like
It's a delicate balance.
yeah, it's a delicate balance between like good enough and too good. We watched Barbarella recently, which held up much better than I thought it was, and was at the same time very like of its era in a lot of bad ways.
I recently had 5 days off from work, and I decided that one of my days I would just dedicate to watching all the movies that I wanted to watch that when I went to the video store when I was a kid, but I was never able to watch because my parents wouldn't let me watch it.
Yeah.
And so I watched like The Warriors, and I watched Repo Man,
Oh yeah.
and
Repo Man's so great.
it's great. It's really great.
Yeah.
I honestly don't think I've ever seen a movie like that, and I don't think I ever will because it was just
I,
such a bizarre movie. But Beastmaster was one of those. I remember that cover
oh yeah.
vividly, and I never watched it, so maybe I have to add it to my list.
Yeah, you should. It's Don Cascarelli. It's the guy who made the Phantasm movies, and Bubba Hotep, and John dies at the end.
Oh wow.
Um, yeah, I mean, it's just a bizarre fucking movie. Like, it's it's amazing that it ended up being on HBO every day for like years.
I do think it's funny that like so when I was growing up, I remember watching there was like so many movies that were just random that I was watching that I'd seen like 30 or 40 times just because it was like on HBO or USA or
Yeah,
something just randomly during the day. And I feel like that's one of those things. It's not quite Byron levels of like knowing like Sirens of Satan and stuff like that. But people who grew up during that time, you're like, did you ever watch this? And they're like, it was on like USA like all the time. And
yeah,
so
exactly.
it's funny how that works. You have this like common language amongst the people who just happen to love watching movies, and they would watch the same ones over and over because that's what was on.
That yeah, it was that kind of thing. I also, we would videotape movies. Like if you'd see something, you're like, oh man, we missed the beginning of that, and you'd wait till like, oh, it's gonna be rerun at 2 in the morning on like one of the HBOs. And like I had a video cassette that had like just the weird movies on it, and friends would come over and we would just watch the same like four movies while we like sat around smoking weed or whatever we were doing in high school. um but I remember we had like Fritz the Cat, and like the heavy metal movie, and like one of the Eddie Murphy stand-up specials. Like just these weird things, but they were like touchstones of like my entire generation had like so many of these similar touchstones. But yeah, one of the movies we watched from that era was Joysticks, which does not hold up very well, if it ever did to begin with. I don't think it ever held up well, even for its era. But its time to nudity was like, oh, in the credits they have full like just gratuitous nudity. And it's one of those movies about it's a video arcade, and like a rich guy is going to take over the video arcade and ruin it. It's one of those like, we all have to rally around and save the thing we love kind of movie.
How have
uh,
I never seen that movie? That sounds like something I definitely would have watched. That's amazing.
it's yeah, it's got like cliche nerds and all the stuff that you love about like 70s and 80s movies, that is just like, you look at it now and you're like, wow, it's hard to believe how quickly our tastes have turned on what is or isn't funny anymore.
Yeah, a lot of the 80s comedies don't age well for that reason.
Yeah, there's a lot of comedies that are just like, huh, well, I guess that could have been considered funny.
Yeah. Oh God, now I know what I'm going to be doing very soon. I'm going to be watching Beastmaster. If only we got that from this podcast, we've gotten that. But Ed, that is all I have for you. Thank you so much for coming on to talk about Reckless Friday writing and everything else. I appreciate you taking the time.
Oh yeah, sure. Thanks for having me.
Thanks for listening to this week's episode of Off Panel with writer Ed Brubaker. You can find him on his email newsletter and in the recently released Friend of the Devil from Image Comics. Love Off Panel, want to support it? Subscribe to the podcast on Apple Podcasts today and give the show a rating and review while you're at it, but 5 stars only. You can also support the show by backing on Patreon. Find the show on Patreon at patreon.com/offpanel. And when you back it on there, you get early access to each week's podcast as well as weekly content and more. Want even more? Subscribe to my subscription comic site, Sketched, at sketch.com for long-form articles, interviews, and the rest of the site's content, and its members-only forum. You can find Off Panel and Sketched on social media by liking it on Facebook at /Sketched, that's SKTCHD, followed on Twitter and Instagram at @SketchComic, or following me at @SliceFriedGold. Big thanks to all my existing patrons, including Elsa Chartier, Luke Nakashoji, Elliot Metz, Dr. Luke, Scott Hazelwood, Scott Buwan, Michael Tunk, Canadian by Proxy, Johnny Cannon, Zach Thompson, Bradley Roeder, Carl Choi's, Megan Marsden, Brandon DePillis, Patrick Broward, Declan Shalvey, Dan Guarino, Josh Williamson, Adam Freeman, Ben Wild, Brian Klein Q, SB, Antonio Offen, Nick Bennett, Daniel Whitfield, Scotty Young, Susanna Polo, Jeff Weira, Reed Hinkley Barnes, Mario Tiambang, AbductedTheComic.com, Andrew Cruda, Matt Mahoney, Charlie Chu, Stephen Hall, Pensacola Pop Comics, Kim Eslin, Philip Myra, Christian Sheldon, Kenny Porter, Chris Pacello, Torrin Greenbeck, Buzz Bubbles, Christopher Todd, Transmitter Down, Wilds Comics and Books, Carl Mizell, Danny Ollie, Pel Slates, Akil Wilson, Alex Demetriopoulos, Terry Dodson, Liana Kangas, Wesley Giff, Sean Kirkham, Alistair Ross, Julio Anta, Brett H. Schmidt, Jason Goodmanson, Paul Reinwant, Vita Ayala, Tara Ferguson, Dave Slusher, WMQ Comics, Akil Kokachi, Sean Pinello, Ken Heidelman, Philip Seavey, Al Ewing, Ryan Alcock, David Kelly, Rob Wilson IV, Nick Polito, Brendan Fletcher, Gary Maloney, Jonathan Nilsson, Matthew Groom, Jason Massey, Adam Bogart, Matthew Taylor, Nick Patera, Jacob Sorelli, Ford Gilmore, David Brawley, Nick Hall, Bjorn Basin, John Hendricks, Steve Anderson, Ian Maxfield, Cliff Chang, Colin McMahon, Chris Palmer, Scott McGovern, Nathan Fairbairn, Kat McKenzie, Adam Highfield, Fiona Staples, Chris O'Halloran, Mark Abnett, Mike Murphy, Michael Shirley, Tom Barnett, Jim Demonakos, Norbert, Nick Lowe, James Kaplan, and Mission Comics and Art in San Francisco. You guys are all the best. A quick thanks to Upright T-Rex Music, who wrote and performed Off Panel's theme song just for the show. Check out their music on Spotify because it's completely delightful. Thanks for listening, and tune in next week for another episode.